Okay, hey everybody, welcome to the None of Our Businesses show and podcast. And I'm Ty Carr, and today I've got Ryan, who is the CEO of Thesis, a digital agency located in Portland, Oregon. He has a diverse business background, so I'm pretty excited to have him on today's episode and hear about his background and what led him to where he is today and to the business that he's into today. So welcome, Ryan. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Ty.
I'll get right into it. I said I introduced you as being the CEO of a digital agency, but what I found is that term digital agency can mean a whole lot of different things. And so I'd like to start out with maybe just telling us about Thesis, what it is today, what kind of services you offer, and who your typical clients are.
Yeah, great. So Thesis, we are a digital marketing and creative agency based in Portland, Oregon. We're about 135 employees, and we work with a lot of business to consumer brands like Adobe and Taco Bell, and of course the largest athletic footwear maker in our backyard here, as well as a handful of others. And so really where we got our roots was in we're very campaign driven, and the reason why we're called Thesis is because that is kind of the North Star of any brand, is to kind of get to that thesis statement. And so a lot of what we do is we're constantly doing hypothesis of this campaign will work based on what we know about the audience that we're sending it to. So that's campaigns in the form of really of email, web, mobile apps, social media, things like that. Our roots definitely are in email marketing. When I started the company almost, 17 and a half years ago, we were called Email ROI. So it evolved over time, and we just recently renamed and rebranded about 9 months ago to Thesis. So that's a big portion of what we do, and we've kind of expanded our capabilities into content for mobile apps for the brands that I mentioned, like within their mobile apps, as well as influencer blog content, and just a lot of really creative digital campaigns in between.
Wow, thank you. And so I'd like to have you take us through your entrepreneurial journey all the way back. I saw that you have a degree from the University of Virginia and actually began in finance. Yeah. And actually began your career as a financial analyst with Intel. And so you went from there to, I think, starting a company. What inspired that move?
Yeah, so I double majored in two seemingly opposite degrees, environmental science and finance. And so I grew up in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., fell in love with the outdoors. So I always say that my environmental science degree got me out to Oregon, because here I am. During this whole COVID bit, which is a whole new world that we're in, my family and we've been at Black Butte Ranch for the past 3 weeks, where we have a place here. And that's originally what brought me out to Portland, was working here during a summer. But finance employed me. So it was really helpful to have that degree. I absolutely respect the work that you do on the accounting side. I'm not an accountant. I've never gotten an accountant degree, but yes, as you mentioned, I was a financial analyst at Intel, and it was very much kind of in an corporate operations finance role of budgets and planning and things like that. A lot of what you do is perform analysis to justify a no. So you justify, like, no, you can't hire 10 more people. No, you can't spend here, do this return on investment analysis to say, no, another metal layer on the chips would cost close to $1 billion or something like that. And so I think part of why I decided to leave Intel and start my entrepreneurial journey, one, both my parents are entrepreneurs, and so definitely have a close-knit family, and really looked up to both of them and their journeys. And two, there's a certain creative expression that you can have as an entrepreneur to create something from nothing. And that can be really risky. And you'll hear in my journey where I have made those really risky decisions and it hasn't panned out at all. And so my journey is very much this like roller coaster of up and down. But fortunately, the last 7 years has been, a real great growth trajectory, as well as a really amazing company culture that I'm super grateful for. So, I don't know if you want me to get into specifics, but that's kind of why I left finance to go start. Originally, it was a commercial construction software company. So like the document approval process, almost like DocuSign, but for getting products approved by the architect and on a commercial, job site. And so
what motivated that change? Because that sounds like that would have been a lot different than what you would have been doing at Intel.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's helpful to be incredibly naive when you're a young entrepreneur to not be aware of how hard it is to start a company. And part of my naivete was that my father is a third generation real estate developer and had a construction background. And so I thought, oh, well, it's in my blood somewhere. And I work at a tech company, so I must know tech, even though I knew finance, but not tech that well at all. So I just floundered around for a couple years, and I met a bunch of other entrepreneurs in the process. In the year 2000, we started this like entrepreneur peer support group called Starve Ups. We were all starving startups. And a couple of the entrepreneurs in that group were co-founders of an email marketing software company called Cooler Email. And I started reselling that software and originally to construction folks, and then it grew into networking a lot with tons of other businesses in Portland. And pretty soon we had several hundred clients, small businesses and a few larger ones, and we email ROI started to really take off, and that started email ROI like formally at the end of 2002.
At what point in this process then did you realize that you were going to become a marketing firm essentially?
It was super organic and, kind of really, there was a lot of, I'm going to try this construction software thing. Okay, that's not working. I'm going to tweak it to building websites for contractors. Okay, that's kind of working, but it's still, there's not a lot of dollars there, and it was really lean. And then, okay, I have some friends that have this email software company, and I just, I guess through my kind of unique ability of building relationships and kind of doing that business development, I became more, I guess, sales oriented than a bean counter. And that really led towards this path of online marketing when I have zero, higher educational background in marketing. I have an undergraduate business degree, but really it was very much more of life skills than it was like formal training in marketing strategies.
As an industry, digital marketing, my understanding is, email was the early days, and then it, of course, we know it kind of went through a lot of transformation and is now, there's a lot to do with social media and content. But given your path and how long you've been at it, you rode that entire wave of the entire industry kind of shifting and changing. I'd love to hear about that a little bit. About did you know it was changing? Was that also organic? How did you deal with going from email to what kind of full service digital marketing is today?
Yeah, no, that hopefully I won't take too long to answer the question, but the email piece, as you talked about, when we first started in 2002, there was a certain kind of magic to marketers being able to see, oh my gosh, our consumers are reading it for this long, they're clicking on it, they're buying, these folks are dropping out. Like the ability to track everything was just totally magical. And then it became more mainstream, and we were fortunate to be this kind of this hybrid between white labeling the software that I told you about, this Cooler Email software program, and also being a full service email marketing agency in the early days. And so we grew really fast because a lot of companies didn't have in-house resources to get those campaigns out. They didn't know the strategies or have the creative folks to do it. And so that added to a lot of growth. And then that naturally grew into pointing an email campaign to microsites that we were already set up from earlier in my construction website days, to have some folks that knew how to build websites and things like that. And so really what happened that was a little kind of like a very traumatic experience, I guess, is I had a lot of, I kind of thought like, oh, we've grown so fast. We were an Inc. 500 fastest growing company in the country. And gosh, we can do anything in a way that there was almost too much ego in it. And so I had this notion to, because we were reselling someone else's software and putting our own logo on it, we didn't have any control of that experience. And so we tried to become a software company in 2008 to 2010, and not only in the email space, but also in the social media and mobile marketing messaging side of things. Really tried to bite off way more than we could chew. And also going from an agency to a software company is incredibly hard. Even when you know how expensive it is and how hard it's going to be, it's still twice as hard as you think. Long story short, lost $1.5 million over that 3-year period. Almost went bankrupt, like had tasted metal in the back of my throat, and which is the last sign you have before having a heart attack. And we went in a 6-month period after we pulled the plug on that. We went from 41 employees to having 38 of those employees leaving because of what a kind of a toxic culture it created of having to have multiple rounds of layoffs and things like that. So it was incredibly painful. I think to answer your question, there was a natural progression towards growing into more things than email through the software experience, as well as through what our clients needed even before that. And then we went back to our roots as an agency, and we rehired a bit in that process. And so we got down to about 15 employees, and that was literally 7 years ago, and then landed Nike as a client, and then Adobe and several others came several years after that. And so we've been on a really, like I said, a very intentional growth journey, but it's also, we've been really intentional about our culture because we've gone from 15 employees to 135. And when you do that, a lot of times it's really hard to keep culture from getting heavily diluted. So that is probably what I'm most proud of where we are right now. Is a really inclusive culture that feels like family and feels like everybody has each other's backs. Especially inspiring during this whole work from home, or what we at Thesis like to call is lead from home. When it's, it's hard to not have your mental health affected by being cooped up in the house and all the things. And it's just been really inspiring to see how our employees have supported one another and really stepped in. So it's been great.
Yeah. Talking about company culture. So, I mean, you are being intentional with it. It's not just some kind of organic thing that just happens. You're doing something to maintain it, because it sounds like it's important to you. You've kind of decided that that's an important part of strategy. are there some key elements to that you can share? What is it intentionally that you do related to company culture?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is unique about Thesis is just over 4 years ago, we really leaned in heavily to equity. And so whether, I'm sure folks are going to see this video, but if it's just the audio portion, I am a white male with a lot of privilege. But what happened, I had kind of a aha moment at a business event in Portland where there were 90 business owners in a room, and a lot of them were my friends. And it was an event that I went to. I wasn't hosting it, but I just, for whatever reason, I just, it should have been incredibly obvious, but I realized, okay, I'm one of 85 white men of these business owners, and 2 women and 3 men of color, and I realized in the moment that I was a huge part of the problem, that I wasn't intentional about building relationships in communities of color and really creating a more inclusive culture. We always have had, from a gender perspective, we've always been 50% or more women at the company and in leadership in all levels, but really weren't intentional around race or other forms of equity as well. So whether it's gender, race, or sexual orientation or other forms of equity, we use that experience and that kind of aha moment to co-found what started as an internship program for over the past 4 years. We've placed 320 college students of color at over 100 companies in Portland, including Intel and Nike and Wine & Kennedy, and at Thesis we've had 19 and hired. We have 10 full-time employees who are now some of whom are becoming managers and things like that. So it's just been a really empowering and kind of personal growth journey for me and for a lot of us in the company. And I think that level of intentionality has had, sometimes they're really hard things that happen, like some leaders in the company a couple of years ago, they talked the talk, but their actions weren't showing in the teams that they formed and things like that, a true commitment to our values around racial equity and diversity. And so so I had to make the hard decision to part ways, and that has created some disturbance. So it doesn't just happen overnight, and it's not all easy things to do, but it's been incredibly rewarding. And I think it's helped to drive innovation for us. I think it's helped. I think our clients have grown more with us because they see our commitment to it in our culture. And it's incredibly obvious if you come to a staff meeting or things like that, where people can truly be themselves at the office. And now they can truly be themselves in their pajamas at home, working and on a lot of these Zoom calls. But no, that's why that's the thing that I'm most proud of at Thesis.
That's fantastic. Yeah, thank you for sharing. I think that sets a great example for our audience and other startup and entrepreneurs who are thinking about how they might do it. I appreciate that. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks everybody. Time. And we will see you guys in the next show or the next segment. Welcome everyone to another episode of the None of Our Businesses YouTube show and podcast. We're here again on a Friday afternoon with Charlie Zygmunt and AJ Wheeler and myself, Ty Carr. And we've got a bunch of current events to discuss here. So take it away, guys. Where do we want to start?
All right. So I've got an article from KPTV called "Local 3D Printing Community Comes Together to Print PPE," which is personal protective equipment for hospitals. And so, as everybody knows, we're in the middle of the coronavirus crisis, and hospitals are short on supplies, and there's kind of a new means of making those supplies available through open source making those schematics available to print those things, and then basically people are able to then download those, print the masks, and provide them to hospitals. And so it's just kind of an interesting way that people are trying to give back to the problem that we're all facing, you know. So I want to get your guys' take on that.
I don't think I've ever seen a 3D printer in action personally. I guess I assumed that the output from a 3D printer was some form of plastic, that it was that all of the, is that not true? I mean, are these face masks then plastic, or can a 3D printer basically print cloth?
No, so they're talking about the face shields themselves. It's plastic.
Oh.
Yeah, there's actually two different kinds of 3D printers. There's what's called an extruder, and then there's another one that uses like electricity and some kind of medium to fuse up a plastic. And so the extruder is basically like, it looks like you have a yarn ball of like weed eater string basically, and it gets fed through an extruder, and that kind of layers it out piece by piece, little, inch by inch, and builds it up on a pad.
Yeah, it's like Westworld.
Yeah, exactly like that. And then the extruder, or the other one that is a fancier version that gives you more of a seamless look to the finished product, is used. There's a medium that electricity is run through, or a laser is run through, and it makes a small, thin piece of plastic at a certain radius or turn that the laser follows. So, and I've actually seen quite a few of these stories pop up. There was actually like a high school science and technology group that was doing the same thing. The Army Corps of Engineers is doing the same thing with their 3D printers. And I thought it was pretty interesting that they're being mobilized in Facebook groups and stuff like that, where they're handing out the freeware for basically like the recipe card for your 3D printer to make these like face shields. So I thought it was interesting. One of the things I didn't see was where they got the plastic for the front of the face shield itself. This is kind of the housing that goes around your head and the bottom that secures against the chest piece. So, but I thought it was a great way there was some small businesses. The one that I saw was a small business, a guy that was 3D prints cookie cutters. That was his online business that he started. And he, of course, didn't have had the time and the resources to make it happen. And so he turned his on and started giving away the plans for free, I guess, to everybody on how to make these face shields. So.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of any time you can use open source technology and just, make something available for where it was prior in a shortage, but it's only a matter of time until the materials needed to make these masks become, constrained as a resource, as we've seen so many other things do recently. And so, yeah, I just thought it was interesting.
I wonder if they can 3D print toilet paper.
I wish. We need to figure that one out. Whoever figures that out is going to be rich.
They do. It's called Dollar Tree, and it's excellent toilet paper, let me tell you.
All right. Do you have another article we can go over, AJ?
So actually, my article I saw come up was the FASB actually announced that they were going to postpone new pronouncements regarding leases to small businesses and nonprofits due to COVID-19, and that they're pushing the implementation date on that back to, it was supposed to come to fruition last year. Anybody with a fiscal year end that started after December 30 or December 15th, 2019 was supposed to now have the lease recognition, where basically you capitalize all leases on a balance sheet instead of, there's no longer operating leases per se unless they're a lease for under a year is the pronouncement. And so they decided to push that back because the implementation and the time required was too costly during the COVID-19 basis. And I was just wondering, the article doesn't mention it, but I can't remember a time when FASB pushed anything back like this due to a pandemic, but I might be wrong. I don't know if that was. So I thought it was kind of a unique situation. And normally these things go to a public discussion or whatever that lasts a few months so everybody can get their 2 cents in. But this one's actually being closed for public opinion within like 2 weeks of them announcing it on Wednesday. So I thought it was interesting. And then the other interesting part about the article is they said they carved out in addition, they also announced that they were, of course, public exposure documents there was one other industry here. Oh, it was franchise businesses that are getting a relief because they were the ones that beat the door down so quickly of the FASB. I guess they mobilized and were spamming them with emails talking about their revenue recognition from franchisees. And so they said they said that they got quite a few calls and emails related to the franchise revenue recognition implementation as well. So those two items have been pushed back.
So you know that they always do this. They make it like some kind of weird date, like December 15th. Any company whose fiscal year starts after that would have to implement. But if we say that in common terms, if you are a small business or a nonprofit that uses a calendar year for your fiscal year 2020, you were on deck to have to implement entirely new accounting standards for your leases, and now you don't. That's been delayed.
That's true. The other thing that's been delayed, they said, is, and this came in with the IRS, was the fact that they delayed the second quarter tax payments until July 15th. So now you're talking about your federal taxes due for 2019, quarter one and quarter two, estimated taxes paid due on July 15th. So
yeah, they've got to expect a huge uptick in delinquency when they bundle up all the payments into one period like that.
Yeah.
Because I don't know that people are going to effectively save, but then again, a lot of people are having a lot less income, so that solves that as well.
Yeah, what we could hope for or push for is that they might delay the second quarter past July 15th. I think the fact that second quarter would have been, I guess it would have been due June 15th, I think is how it works, right? And so the fact that they're pushing that back to July 15th, at very least that makes more sense and is easier to handle computationally, because most people are basing somehow in part their quarterly estimated taxes off their prior year tax return filing. So it was a little bit wonky to not have your tax return filing due until July 15th, but have to make quarterly estimates on the next year when you haven't even filed the previous year yet, right? So I think that pushing it back at least aligns that from a conceptual standpoint, that you're not having to like jump through unusual mental hurdles to think about what your next year's taxes would be when you haven't even completed the previous year's taxes.
And I think most of the people I saw kind of bashing the ruling, talking about all those three payments being stacked up on top of each other, were making the point that, it's April now and they're applying for the PPP payroll protection plan loans, basically grants. We're going to get through that process, then have to turn around and start operating the business again and get it up and running, and then turn around and be able to bank away enough money to pay taxes from 2019 estimated quarterlies. And then, I guess more to their point was the manpower it was going to take to get all that stuff done for everybody involved, as opposed to just the money portion of it being a real headache of trying to come up with that kind of cash in that what seems like a very short amount of time.
Yeah, it definitely feels that way. So I've got another article. I can kind of switch gears if you don't mind. So I've got an article from CNN about Amazon's dominance during the coronavirus. So, as everybody is staying home more, everybody's buying books and whatnot online and trying to turn to suppliers that they wouldn't normally buy from. And so you would expect a huge uptick in Amazon's orders. But one of the interesting kind of side effects of the whole coronavirus has been that people have been staying at home using the services like Twitch and like Netflix and all these other streaming services that rely on Amazon Web Services kind of framework. And so it was kind of, the article looked at how that was their most profitable sector and how people are using those services more than ever. And so my experience comes from working in an Amazon business. And so I know that I can speak for our company when I say that sales have kind of gone up a lot in places that have been heavily affected by the coronavirus. And so I guess I just wanted to kind of open that up for discussion and see what you guys thought about that.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised to learn the bottom line. They mentioned the bottom line of Amazon in there, and it was basically 4 billion with a B revenue projected for this year, and that's an increase of what they had thought they were going to get. And so I was a little bit blown away by that. But I think anybody that's worked around any kind of software companies or online companies or any of that knows that Amazon Web Services leads by a mile in that kind of category. I know that Google and a couple other companies try to compete, but they're very small. I guess the amount of data that they handle or the amount of web traffic that they handle compared to AWS is just minor. So I don't think it was surprising to me when I heard that they were kind of the uptick, not only from online buying, but from the actual web services themselves was so high.
Yeah, I have to say I hadn't thought about it in terms of the AWS effect. I mean, I certainly had thought about just myself and my wife and us being at home and thinking about the concept of retail therapy and just with stress and anxiety over the current crisis. I think some people kind of soothe themselves by just buying more stuff, right? And so I assume that knowing Charlie and knowing in his business that Amazon that they were seeing a higher volume of Amazon activity, and then on top of that, just assuming that they're probably logistically the fact that people can get stuff they might not otherwise get, where they can get stuff and maintain their social distancing without having to go to a supermarket or to another kind of retail outlet to get things that they otherwise need. I think there's that effect, but then also, like I said, the retail therapy effect, people just buying stuff they don't even need just because they're bored at home and they're looking for something to do. And online shopping is one of those things. Some people with disposable cash, which sounds almost terrible to say at this point because so many people are suffering, but there is people out there with disposable cash flow still, even as it is today, that no doubt are doing a little bit of retail therapy.
I'm wondering if the stress eating is going to line up with the retail therapy when they get the clothes home to try it on, if that's going to pile on to the sorrows of the COVID-19, because you're stress eating and retail therapy clothes that don't fit anymore.
I think it will. I'll bake that into my projections come next month. But yeah, no, there's that. And I think the other kind of interesting thing that's happening is that Amazon has kind of become a little bit reluctant. Customers are becoming more open to delays as all these shipping channels have been affected by coronavirus. And Amazon doesn't want to have the bad PR of shutting a company down for shipping timelines during this stressful time. And so I've seen that they've kind of really, set back and not been as aggressive about performance metrics and whatnot. And so I thought that was kind of interesting as well. But yeah.
That is interesting. I wasn't aware of people being all right with not being able to get, their Nintendo 3DS delivered yesterday, if they order it today.
Yeah, I think it's just that people have kind of come to terms with it and they're so desperate. And there's so many, I think when like basic supplies like toilet paper are hard to come by, that it's difficult to get mad about a book being late or about, some disposable income that, that you spend on Amazon taking longer.
Seems like now's the time if you're thinking about an online retail business. If you already were an online retailer, then there's probably opportunity to grow your business. But yeah, if you've had a business idea, I'm sure a lot of entrepreneurs are probably thinking about, well, how can they become online friendly, online retailers that maybe grow and expand new businesses this way.
Yeah, I think Powell's recently in Portland. We're from Portland, and so there's a big bookstore here called Powell's. It's very famous, and it has shut down because of the whole coronavirus. But I know that they've been trying to get all of their inventory online, and they've made an extra push to do that as a result of this. I'm not sure if they will if they're going to go that route, or if they're going to, shutter for the foreseeable future. But yeah, there's a big increased interest in trying to, in sales channels that still operate because now there's no other choice,
So the next one I had was, where is it? Oh, this was kind of funny. So there was an SBA, the Small Business Association Nevada's district director, Joseph Amato, was on a live stream kind of giving everybody an update on the lending for the payroll protection program. Basically, if our viewers don't know by now, the payroll protection plan loans are issued through banks as part of the CARES Act, and they are forgivable payroll protection loans. And so you can borrow a portion of what your payroll costs would be, and if you spend it on those kind of costs, then it will be forgiven after a time frame. So there was kind of a land grab that was happening last week because everybody thought they had to have their applications in by Friday, and people were getting really nervous. In fact, I had calls from clients that were kind of freaking out. They needed to get their application in as soon as possible because they thought they were going to run out of money. And a lot of banks were not even accepting applications last week. And so this guy, unfortunately, was receiving the ire of people asking questions and kind of blew up at the whole idea that the banks were holding back, and mentioned that they had gotten bailouts and they got all this free money and now they're slow to lend it. But in fact, I think he was kind of, my personal take on it, I think he was probably misplaced in his anger and ire, and probably was just a frustration moment. The banks themselves probably didn't have the infrastructure available or the ability to correctly administer loan applications for this because it was so brand new and so such a quick turnaround on it, that very few banks had the agility to be able to put this loan application in process within 3 or 4 days of when it was being released, and have all of their ducks in a row and have the lawyers comb over all this stuff to make sure that the loan applications were correct. So, but I'd like your guys' take on it.
Yeah, I definitely had 2 separate bankers in the last couple of days tell me that they're working 16-hour days to try to keep up on training for this new PPP, for submitting the applications. There's been a bunch of back and forth from even like big payroll providers like ADP had discrepancies in how they perform the calculation. And so there's been reports given with certain numbers, and then they come back and say, okay, we didn't do that right, we're going to fix it. And so I think it's just a very hectic time right now for everybody. And, you know, the bankers are doing the best they can to implement the system. But like you said, with all things changing so quickly and with so many hindrances in normal operations, I think it's just a recipe for a poor implementation, you know? So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and the government official you were talking about who was complaining about the bank's responsiveness, I mean, they referenced back to the 2008 crisis, right? And said, you know, they got bailed out back then, but now they're not stepping up to do their part. And I mean, I think there is some of that back and forth finger pointing because the government passed the CARE Act to say that this program would be available, but the details of exactly how we work and what the rules were for the calculations for, you know, you have to define these things. Like, what do you mean? What is average payroll that you're going to multiply by 2.5 in order to come up with your loan base? And then what is actually acceptable in terms of the use of those funds? And there's still things that are unknown and undefined that have been kind of kicked down the road because it was like, well, you can initiate the loan without knowing certain things about how the exact forgiveness will happen later. And so I think that the Treasury was issuing regulations or they were issuing rules and facts and additional guidance on this the day that banks were supposed to be able to open up applications. But that same day, the Treasury was still issuing some guidance. So on that side, you could say, well, I think to AJ's point, you could say, well, hey, you know, the banks are working on it, but the government didn't come through with thorough guidance that allowed them to really step up to the plate. And that's what Chase, for example, said. The largest bank said, hey, look, you know, we need more guidance from the government on how this is supposed to operate before we're going to take the risk of jumping in. I think that the other side of it, though, is you know, when you can both appreciate but also have a bit of cynicism about the bank's position, because, you know, what the banks are really, what they're really saying and where they're really sitting on this issue is, if they don't dot all their I's and cross all their T's, they're worried that they'll be holding a portfolio of loans that can't be forgiven because they ultimately don't meet the correct SBA guidelines after they were issued. And so now they have all these loans to people that may not be forgiven, and maybe if they didn't maybe if they didn't actually adhere to the government standards, the SBA won't even guarantee them. And so the bank then has to work that out with the business. And they're just sitting on a ton of potentially bad debt, right? And so, I mean, that's why the bank, when you look at it, you say, that is why, fundamentally, that's why the banks we're taking extra steps and not just jumping in and opening applications immediately without taking extra time and steps to verify things, was because of that risk. And knowing that, then you can reflect back on what this government official is saying in terms of, well, fair point. Maybe that's not, maybe they should take an extra risk because the taxpayer took an extra risk on them back in 2008. And so maybe they should take an extra risk and step up here, even if they don't know all the answers. And even if it does mean that they might be sitting on a portfolio of some debts that don't work out for them, maybe they should be doing that given that they got bailed out previously. And yeah, we can say should, maybe, whatever, but right, of course they're not going to do that if they're not required to. So be it.
Yeah, and I think, banks have to look after their own bottom line as well. They employ people. I think they're probably an easy target to, shake your fist at or raise ire to. But I think, they like you said, they're taking the risk of loaning the funds and then having a dud of a loan sitting on their balance sheet that they can't get repaid because it's either not forgiven, or they have their loan. The person they loaned the amount to isn't able to make the payments back because.
But it's supposed to be guaranteed, right? So if they meet just to be clear on that point of what I'm saying there is that if the loan is considered proper under the regulations in the CARES Act, then they don't have that risk because it's guaranteed. The loan itself is guaranteed by the SBA.
Yes. But
the risk is they could be sitting on a debt that isn't guaranteed if in the aftermath, if in the analysis after the fact, it's determined that they didn't actually meet the criteria because we rushed to set this up and nobody understood the rules properly.
And just to kind of elaborate on that, I mean, I can say that with all of the banks that I've personally worked with so far throughout this process, they've all asked for something that is materially very similar, but definitely there are subtle differences to what they believe is the right workings to prepare for this. And so it just kind of goes to that fear of like, yeah, maybe they won't implement this right because it's not clear what, exactly is needed and what some of the finer points are in the calculation, So I thought that was really interesting. And then I have another kind of interesting article on the same topic from Forbes entitled, it's called "Don't Revive Boeing by Killing Capitalism." And so what the article does is it takes a look at kind of the finance theory behind big bank bailouts in times of crisis. And it looks at what happened back in 2008. And it looks at whether or not it is right for when bailouts happen. The biggest fear of the person writing the article is that the companies receiving the bailout are going to use the money to basically buy back treasury stock, boosting their stock price in a way that doesn't help the greater good of society. And so it looks at and tries to compare the size of the bailout to the dividends of the last 5 years of Boeing, and may use that to make a claim to say that they have not used that money wisely, or that they won't use that money wisely. And so I guess the interesting point that he makes is that he believes that we should structure bailouts in such a way that the performance of those companies results in payouts to the people who are ultimately investing into these companies, which in this case, I guess, would be the government bailing out these companies. And so I kind of wanted to open it up for discussion on whether or not you thought an equity stake in a business makes sense as a way of distributing a bailout.
Yeah, I mean, in theory, it sounds great, right? I mean, I think, well, it depends on what side of the political fence I think you're on. But in theory, I think most people would agree that if big companies are lent money and then by the taxpayer, the people, then at some point, if they become profitable again, they should have to pay back some of that money in the form of some kind of retribution or repayment of what was lent to them. That being said, though, good luck trying to get this thing passed in the current American governmental system. I mean, if you just look at healthcare, they've tried to get a universal healthcare or some kind of government option for individuals across the country, and that hasn't happened. And if you're going to talk about then the American public, or more specifically the government itself, taking a position in a company, I don't know if that's going to fly in America these days. I mean, I just don't see it happening.
Yeah, I think I guess the way I would talk about this without putting my finger on the scale of global political philosophy is just the way I define the problem. There's no way to talk about this without getting somewhat political, but the suggestion that if the government provides money to a company in a bailout, that the government should then potentially take an equity position in that company, I would say that there's other ways to achieve the objectives that the author was getting at without them taking an equity position. And I think that you can't take lightly the idea of a government, any government, having an equity position in a company, because that's the hallmark of being in the socialist to communist spectrum of how governments are and economies are run. That is government owning the means of production, and that from that perspective, I would say if the objective is to prevent companies and executives from buying back their own stock with bailout dollars, you can make a rule about that specific issue. You don't have to jump to the government owning equity in the company. If the objective is to ensure that the taxpayers who are bailing a company out ultimately get the money back and maybe some rate of return, it is on the socialist side to be bailing out the company anyway, and it would be also somewhat socialist to structure that as a loan with repayment and debt, and have standard commercial debt covenants and certain kind of what we call negative rights that would allow the government to have certain choices about what happens within the board of directors. But at least that form of socialism wouldn't be as far down the path as the government literally owning an equity stake in the company and owning the means of production. And let's keep in mind, the major country in this world right now where the government owns the means of production in a variety of industries is China. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing we'd be talking about. So I'd say my overall point on this is not to, again, put my thumb on whether we should be socialist and communist or capitalist, but to simply say that would be not a simple or a decision to be taken lightly. Not to just say, oh yeah, it makes sense, we should get our money back, so why don't we get some stock in this company and that company. It's not that light of a decision. It would be a pretty profound thing for the government to take ownership in the equity of corporate America like that, in my view.
Yeah, and the article doesn't really make it clear, but I kind of got the feeling that the person writing it intended for maybe the individual taxpayers to somehow be the ones to reap the individual rewards. And so I guess maybe his imagined way of implementing that would be to issue stock to people as individually. But I feel like even that has so many just administrative burdens of implementation that are so difficult to do that, doesn't really make sense.
Now that's a fascinating idea, right?
Yeah.
Make a government investment in the company as a bailout, and then cause the company to issue stock and distribute that stock among the taxpayers, so the stock is not sitting in the hands of the bureaucratic machine that's the government. That's a fascinating idea. I never thought much about it. It's interesting. Yeah.
Well, and it's also kind of interesting to think about, because it's like, on the one hand, we do look at healthcare and we say, well, that is such a universal good and such a universal need that we all need, that we don't believe universal healthcare is necessarily socialism. But we look at transportation and the airline industry, and we know that, the price of goods is so heavily linked to that it's, whether you use it directly or not, it's just such a core thing to everyone that it's just kind of interesting to define which industries are important enough in the greater good of society to be, relevant to this discussion, basically.
Yeah, and I would maybe, I will kind of parse what you said there a little more carefully, in the sense that certainly there are plenty of people in this country who do believe that universal healthcare is socialism, and academically speaking, I would say universal healthcare is a form of socialism. There are forms of socialism in this country we already have. Medicare is already a form of socialism. When you say it's not something that we necessarily would believe is socialism, I think what you mean is it's not something you and me personally would necessarily believe is a bad form of socialism that's going to end the country's economy as we know it.
I guess what I feel like is there's a lot of people who would subscribe to universal healthcare before they feel like they would categorize themselves as a socialist.
Exactly, yeah.
Socialist idea.
Yeah, the government owning stock in corporations, yeah.
Yeah, they hold them in their mind as a separate kind of thing, though, I think. And maybe I'm putting words in the mouths of people who you don't actually think that, but I've gotten that feeling talking to people before. And so, yeah, it's just interesting to think about which goods are of that importance.
Yeah, and I think, if you put that on a spectrum, my perspective on this, and not everyone will necessarily even agree with this point, but if you put that on a spectrum of, capitalism to socialism all the way to communism, and if you're putting that on a spectrum, I should probably go the other way because this is my right hand and this is my left hand. But if you're putting that on a spectrum, it seems to me that the government owning part of the means of production, owning stock in companies, is way farther left on the spectrum towards communism than the government having a single payer healthcare system, right? And so these different kinds of things are all kind of maybe have different levels of socialism to their policies. But yeah, that just speaks to this whole point of it would be an amazing hopscotch to just like jump past universal healthcare, like as AJ said, we can't really agree on, and suddenly have the government own stock in private companies. That would be an amazing game of checkers to just jump right over the opponent that way.
I think the other chess piece in all of this is, if you were, and the reason why I just don't think this would ever get passed is you're talking about a dilution of shares there. You're talking about current shareholders then having their shares diluted by the rest of America, and it would make it, I think, and they have a lot of lobbying power, and so I don't necessarily know that you would be able to even get past a first round of talks if you're talking about diluting the investing portion of the U.S. economy, investment in large blue chip companies that are supposed to be really big, really high dividend. That good luck. And that's besides the point of talking about how some people view like the police and fire department as acceptable socialistic kind of things that we accept are for the greater good and paid for it by everybody kind of thing, where we can't get over the hump on healthcare and all those other pieces. I think before you even get to that point, I think it would be a full stop just based on the lobbying power of investors themselves in these companies.
And I think the one thing we're all agreeing on is that healthcare is a more universal good than the airline industry when it comes to it's acceptably socialized. All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in, watching, listening. Please comment, rate, like, subscribe. This has been the None of Our Businesses podcast, and we appreciate you all for tuning in these crazy times. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.